Welcome, friends, back to the Regeneration Podcast. Co-host Michael Martin trying to get his desktop arranged and be professional at the same time, and failing miserably. But I'm here with my friend and comrade at arms, Mike Sauter. How's it going, Mike?
Good. I for today's guest, also I ran downstairs and got a book by Piotr Kropotkin, and I thought it might be relevant. As I read more and more into his wonderful book Beyond, just the idea of cooperation. And I just got so excited to talk. A poem in itself is the word cooperation.
That's right.
Yeah.
Hey, so, how are things there in the Finger Lakes, Mike?
Beautiful summer. Right now, the humidity's staying around. So last week we were talking about our soil being healthy and our gardens being pure. Enough humidity that I lost most of my cherries this year. A disease that, just a fungus came. And then my cucumbers are under decent attack. I tend to plant things too close together. I'm not greedy. I like growing things up. So my cucumbers are trellising up, but they're not getting enough air circulation, and that's on me. What?
From cucumber beetles or from fungus?
I just think it's a fungus. I plant things too close together and they don't get circulation.
Because with cucumbers,
it looks cool though. Yeah.
With cucumbers, actually, what spreads the virus, the fungal virus to them, is cucumber beetles. That's why people.
Oh, really? Wow.
It's not really the eating the leaves that kills the plants. It's the virus that's with them.
Yeah. Interesting.
So,
how about
things your mother never told you? What?
Yeah, your garden's still going great.
Yeah. Our cucumbers. In fact, we weren't paying attention because last week when we packed vegetables for the CSA on Thursday, there were a couple out there. But Bonnie went out Saturday and there were like 40.
Yeah.
She had to get into the refrigerator. So yeah, so it's taken off.
Yeah. And now I'll remind my readers, my garden is doing great. I've been treated my soil well, it's doing great. It's just don't be a greedy gardener. Give things, if they say plant something 6 feet apart, plant it 6 feet apart.
And I gotta tell you a cool thing before we get started today, Mike.
Do it.
So right after we finish today, I have to run out of the house to the Detroit area to a rehearsal of
with
the
Bob
Corktown
Seger.
Popes. No, well, close.
Oh, wow, the Corktown Popes.
Because
you need to know when I think like when I see you sing some of the songs, the one where the video shot in the bar. It's great music. Song. It's great music, Michael. It's great. Yeah.
But anyway, so I got called out of retirement because
you're going to play the mandolin.
I'm not going to play. I'm going to play banjo actually this time.
Okay.
But I get called out of retirement because do you know who Don Was is?
I know the name. I do.
Don Was from Detroit, big time producer. I mean, he's produced the Rolling Stones, Paul McCartney. He produced Love Shack by the B-52s long ago. Bonnie Raitt. He's produced everybody. And he comes to Detroit every year to put on a free concert, and he calls on some Detroit area musicians. This is the third time he's asked us.
Wow.
And he has a theme every year. And this one is peace, love, and understanding.
I like that. I don't know that. Wow, that's a good theme.
And especially for this year, I think that's why he's super.
I think Elvis Costello thought you could hang a whole worldview on it.
And actually, that's the Corktown Popes. I believe we are kicking off the show, playing that song.
Okay.
What's so funny about peace, love, and understanding? And we're playing "All You Need Is Love" by the Beatles.
Yeah. My anti-war friend, Bill Kaufman, great writer on politics. Find him. Writes from Batavia, New York. Went home. Does good for the localism. He quotes Elvis Costello a lot. Like, we can bring it, we can make it simple. Or William Blake, kindness, mercy, pity, peace, and love,
That's right. And so that gig it's called the Concert of Colors, which is next Sunday, the 21st, at the Detroit Film Theater. So if anybody who listens and is in the Detroit area,
Michael's opening up the whole concert.
And actually, well, another person playing on that gig is actually, remember Marshall Crenshaw?
Yeah, I do. Marshall Crenshaw Band. Yeah.
And he's from Detroit. Yeah.
You got Marshall Tucker Band, Marshall Crenshaw Band.
A lot of fun. Yeah. And those are always fun concerts. You play before 4,000 people. It's a lot of fun. But speaking of peace, love, and understanding,
cooperation.
Today's guest, Professor Martin Nowak from Harvard University. He's a scientist. And we're going to talk to him about poetry, because that's what we do here. Because we know there's kind of the sociological impulse, right? Going back to Goethe, is finding the place where theology, philosophy, poetry, and science meet. And we're going to talk about that today with our guest. Now, I got to tell you the story before this happens, though. So about a year and a half ago, I'm guessing, my publisher, John Reese I keep talking about him. I wonder if I know he watches the show.
Sometimes you're running him down pretty good.
Well, yeah, he never mentions that I talk about him.
Yeah, say good things about him this time.
The
Good
thing
things
is, he's really shy. He just does not
Yeah.
like attention. So he's probably just, Michael, shut up. But about a year and a half ago, he sent me this manuscript and he said, Michael, can you look at this and tell me what you think? So I started looking at it. And maybe 3 weeks went by. He emails me back, what's going on with that manuscript? So I said, I'm still reading it. And usually when I read a manuscript, I just look, through it a bit, read a little bit of the first chapter, go a few pages up, look at it again, see how, and then it usually doesn't take me more than an hour or hour, to make an evaluation. But this one, it's not that I couldn't make the evaluation, but I wanted to read the whole thing because it was that good. And I was very fascinated and intrigued.
I thought you probably had to read the whole thing of every book.
What's
Consider me a naive outsider, but when they say review a book. When I write reviews for like Front Porch Republic, I do a weird thing apparently.
Well,
I read the book.
Writing a book review is a different thing than evaluating a manuscript.
I know, but when it's for fair. Yep.
It really is, because what you're looking for in a evaluating manuscript.
Yes, yeah, no,
well written.
That's a distinction with a difference. I agree.
Right, and then if it is well written, then you read more of it. And this one was really well written, and I kept reading. I wanted to spend time with it. It wasn't that I just wanted to do it for it was not like a job. I was enjoying it, and I didn't want it to end.
Yeah,
and
it does have that hypnotic effect, the way it's set up.
And then later, and I told John, I said, yes, this is a work of genius. You should publish it. I don't care if you don't sell any. I don't care. Like the old thing with Tolkien's publisher, right? When he looked at the Lord of the Rings, is it a work of genius? Yes, you should publish it. We might lose money. Doesn't matter if it's work of genius. We'll publish it. And it is a work of genius. And then I had the pleasure. John asked me to copy edit the book, or was it proofread? I can't remember which one. Which was also doubly enjoyable. And so I just thought we have to talk to this man about the book, because I think it's an important book, and we have some heavy hitters, including me.
Sarah Coakley, I've talked to her before. David Bentley Hart, we had him on the podcast. These are heavy hitters, folks.
And James Matthew Wilson, we should have him on too.
He's a Front Porch guy too. He's a good guy.
James?
Yeah, I mean, he was early in, pretty evolved. I don't know if he would consider himself one of the founders, but a big influence.
Okay, because he was supposed to. He comes to Michigan. He's from Michigan.
Yeah.
And he was supposed to come and visit me when he went on a fishing trip, but he ghosted me. Sorry, Jim. But anyway, welcome to the program, Dr. Martin Nowak.
Hello, it's great to be here.
And I wonder if you could just give us and our audience a little bit of your background, and tell us how you got here.
So growing up in Vienna, I went to a Catholic school, which was a formative experience for me, and I really actually enjoyed my time there. I was there in primary school and then middle and high school altogether for 12 years. And actually it was the hardest test for me of my life, because everything else afterwards was easy in comparison, because the academic demands were actually enormous there. And I felt that university was much easier afterwards.
What other famous people went there, Martin?
Sorry?
Were there other famous people who went there who changed the world?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, yes, maybe, But
I hear you. I know I did not experience that type of education.
It was called Albertus Magnus Schule, actually. Albertus Magnus, much later. When I was there, I never actually really knew who that was, even though we had a school hymn about him. But later, of course, I knew he was the teacher of Thomas Aquinas and the great scientist of his time. It was actually also that at school, I could only imagine to become a medical doctor. And one day a teacher told me, you are a scientist, and I actually didn't know what he was talking about. So I was about to enroll in the University of Vienna to study medicine. And in the last summer, before doing that, I read a book which was called The Eighth Day of Creation. It was the history of molecular biology, and it fascinated me. And I realized actually I want to understand the chemical foundation of life. So I changed my course and I enrolled in biochemistry. And my parents were a bit worried, but then I started to study biochemistry, and only about in the physics lecture, so that was again like a year later, I realized that mathematics was the language of science, and I hadn't realized that actually in school. So mathematics, I liked mathematics. It was somehow like solving puzzles or so. I didn't realize it was the language of science. When I realized it became the language of science, it changed everything for me. And I wanted to become a scientist, but a theoretician, so one who works with mathematics. That's what I then did in Vienna, and I studied theoretical chemistry, and then I did a PhD in mathematics. Then I went to Oxford, and I was for 9 years in Oxford, and then I got an offer from the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, which is quite an amazing place. And I was there. I was the first biologist who was recruited by the Institute to lead a biology initiative there for 5 years. And then I got an offer from Harvard in 2003. So ever since then, I have been at Harvard University as a professor of mathematics and of biology.
Oh, nice. Now it reminds me, I have 9 children, and one of my sons is a scientist. And after I read the book, I called him up. I said, Tommy, you gotta when this book comes out, I'm sending you a copy. Because it's a very similar description of your journey, even though he was homeschooled, and he kept complaining to me about being homeschooled when he was reading Plato and Homer and all this stuff. And I said, no, don't worry. When you go to college, you will be so far ahead of everybody, you won't even believe it. And your professors will all love you, which is, that was my experience of going to Catholic school as well. I mean, I'm from the same generation as you, Martin. But my other son, my son Aiden, who's 23, at Tommy's wedding a couple years ago, he had a couple drinks, and he cornered me.
Couple always means a couple too many.
A couple too many. But he wanted to talk to me. He said, Dad, I got to talk to you. I said, why? You're the only person who will understand what I have to say. I said, okay, what is it? I said, I think math is mysticism. And I said, oh, I think you're onto something, because he's pretty gifted mathematically, not unlike his father. And I think I see, well, that's what I see in your book, Martin, with a beautiful cover.
That's the genus.
Is that there's and this is, I think, David Bentley Hart, that he said the same thing. What a marvelous and fruitful collision of the scientific, poetic, and contemplative temperaments, all in one author in one book. I think it's an accurate description of my experience of reading the book. And it's so, as I was reading through it, it was awakening things in me as well. So I wonder if at this point you could read a little bit from the beginning of the book for our audience.
Yes, I can do that. So I started to work on this book in March 2019. Suddenly I had this idea, and the opening of the book was actually then suddenly in my mind. And this is what I want to read to you. So this is how the book starts. I think of the book somehow as a musical piece. It is also organized in movements for some reason. It has 6 movements, like a Mahler symphony. Mahler is one of my favorite composers. And this is describing now, it starts basically in midst of an encounter. And the encounter is between 2 people, and they just have met. And for a long time, I was thinking, actually, how did they meet? And I couldn't figure that out. So I realized I don't know how they met. All I can say, this is how I can start the book. This is where it is right now. So it starts like this movement. This is movement 1 opening. They walked uphill through vineyards, immersed in musings over philosophy. They had met a few days before. She was curious, asking many questions. They were all natural, childlike, and deep. So were his answers. Spring had just started, and the world had a new meaning in her presence. When they reached the top of the hill, they sat down in the grass, which was warm and dry. In front of them was a small town, Behind it, a river with forests. Hills were rolling in the distance. The two medieval towers of a monastery pointed to heaven. What is truth? She asked. Do you mean logos? I mean truth. Her eyes were penetrating, as if she could see into his soul. He did not hold her gaze for long. He looked elsewhere. He noticed the stillness of the trees, the gentle unfolding of the clouds. The world is whatever is the case. This is how the conversation starts. So the question, her first question, and this is the first question of the book, is what is truth?
And there's so much, but what I love about it is this is a question that's pursued through the book and through many different movements, but it starts as a love story, which is it's extraordinary, and it's as it only should be in a way, right? So what is it about this love story that attracts this scientist?
No, I think the whole idea, I mean, the goal of the book somehow is to make people fall in love with God. So in some sense, what I want to say in the book, that there are many kinds of love. And for me, the most fascinating love is, of course, this very, very strong romantic, platonic love, meaning to include everything. This is the proper interpretation of Eros. But all love ultimately is for God, and several philosophers have pointed this out. So the whole idea is set up in the beginning as a love story. And of course, people should love each other. They should fall in love with each other. That means to fall in love with God. So to properly love somebody is to love God in that person. And that kind of is really the theme of the opening movement, and that goes throughout.
It does go through this.
I like this kind of as a philosopher. The book is about philosophy also. And what I find so beautiful about philosophy is that a philosopher is a lover of wisdom. And wisdom is God. And the philosopher is therefore a lover of God. And this is how Plato understood it. And this is how Augustine understood it.
Absolutely. And you remind me of one of my favorite American poets in the poem Richard Wilbur in Love Calls Us to the Things of This World. What a beautiful poem. Now, so is it, I mean, this wasn't the questions we gave you, but it came up. So do you, it's not as common, I think it's not common in the humanities for sure, but I'm sure in the sciences it's very similar, for a scientist to be a person of faith. We know that it's a stereotype. I think there's a lot of truth to the stereotype. How does that inform you, the way you do science?
So for me, science is to study the world. But at the same time, the ultimate goal of science is to figure out laws of nature. And laws of nature are formulated in terms of mathematics. So these laws of nature are actually mathematical objects that are about underlying ultimate truth. So I think as scientists, we study secondary causations in the material world, but ultimately we want to understand laws of nature, and these are abstract objects. They are not in matter, they are not in the material, and therefore a scientist actually who studies the material world does more than that, and most scientists are kind of oblivious to that fact. So for me, that's already a pointer to what is divine, because these laws of nature, they live in a world outside and beyond the material, so they are, for me, part of the underlying reality.
So interestingly said. Yeah.
And I mean, that's interesting for me too. I think the difference between my way of being in the classroom when I am in the classroom and so many of my colleagues is I'm in love with literature. And I think literature is the same groping for truth and ultimate reality, right? Not everybody agrees with me, and too bad for them. So and I can't help but think of Goethe again, right? Where one of the things Goethe said was, if a man has science and art, he has religion. But if he has neither science nor art, give him religion, right? But I think there's so much truth to that, because I think if you do have science and art, you do have, I mean, there's a kind of natural religion that just arises there. It's inescapable. And like, was it who was it that said, Werner Heisenberg, I think, who said at the first sip of the cup of science, you're an atheist, but when you get to the bottom of the glass, you find God waiting for you there. Right? And I think there's truth to that. I remember telling my son is the scientist. I think he was going through an atheist period in college, and I told him that I think he made him step back a little bit. Okay, yeah, what do you know? And then I think it's dawned on him now. So another thing I wanted to ask though, Martin, is why now had you written poetry before for this book?
No, I not really. But also when I started writing the book, I was not at all thinking that I was writing poetry.
Really?
Yeah, it happened only when James Matthew Wilson looked at it for the first time, and then when you looked at it, that the two of you told me.
Okay, but go into this. What did it look like on the paper?
No, to me, it was clear that this was the style. So it's the style that we have on paper. So it's in this kind of format.
It was that, okay.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
was, but I didn't think of poetry. I just thought I'm writing it in the simplest possible way because my quest was always for simplicity. I find simplicity very beautiful. So also in science, I'm not done with my work until I have the simplest possible model for something, or the simplest
I
possible.
like that you're saying that. I really do.
All I wanted is to write it as simple as possible and as readable as possible in some sense. And I didn't think of it as poetry. It was just very natural. This was the natural format. This was the stream of the conversation that kind of came out of me.
But the conversation was in your mind from the get-go. You didn't add the wisdom stuff later.
No,
because you can almost read some of the paragraphs about the history of the universe. And
but
maybe you went in later.
I knew there was, I wanted to talk about scientific content. So there's a lot of scientific content in the book because I want to use I want to explain where science places us in the cosmos. But the way how the whole book unfolds is typically I get up very early in the morning and the first thing is I start to work on this book. And then for me, it becomes like a prayer. And I feel I have to be fully focused because I don't want to interfere. I don't want to do anything. I don't want to mess it up. I want to take myself out completely. And so then whenever I go over the text again, and I'm going over it again and again, I want to make sure that it's not me who is in it. That at least it's not something, it's just as it is. I want it on the page as it is without me messing it up.
Yeah, and I think that's beautiful. And I think that's what makes it poetry. Because I think, my academic expertise is in metaphysical poets. And I know I've told the story before, but Simone Weil, the French philosopher who fell in love with the metaphysical poets long ago, and she memorized and translated the poem Love 3 by George Herbert. And she came from an atheistic background, and she would recite this poem to herself. And she wrote to a priest. She said, well, after a while, when these recitations really became a prayer. And during one of these prayers, as I told you before, Christ himself came down and took possession of me. And that's where poetry, I think, is its most sublime, when it does become prayer. Because, like you say, Martin, the poet doesn't know what he's doing. And the more he puts himself into it, the worse the poetry is. And to make that something awaken or arrive, there is a strange, tell me if this is your experience. There's a strange experience of being present, but not kind of enforcing the intellect or the will into what you're doing. So there's an interaction with it, but it kind of, that presence allows whatever is there to speak, where it does become kind of
I would say more than Sophia, you have a divine feminine Aletheia, truth, right? Because I kind of like a both and image, but I prefer kind of to think that Martin is pushing the boundaries of prose, because it's a reaction against most prose that is just so weird, my own included. Let me throw myself in there. But I understand everything, and I'm not trying to contradict it, Michael, but it's fun. It was really fun for me only moments ago to hear Martin say he was writing it just in the clearest terms possible. That kind of makes me feel more expansive than just putting it into the poetry realm. But I don't mean to end the conversation there. It's not even,
No, it's
yeah,
beautiful.
yeah, okay.
And so to move further,
Yeah.
now it's unmistakably a Catholic text as you go through it. Unmistakable. It could only have come through someone with a kind of a sacramental intuition into the universe, right? Because the universe, or you can call it science, speaks through this, and there's this feminine figure. Who is that feminine figure? I love her.
Yeah, I want to call her Alethea.
Who is she?
You ask me, that's a question.
Yes, I'm
or-
asking you.
Yeah.
So this is very interesting. I don't know. Suddenly she was there, and when I started to have her, when I started to work on this book in 2019, I realized that I have been thinking about her when I was 12 years old. So I have been thinking about that figure, that woman, that female presence when I was 12 years old.
Wow,
And
this is
there
wild.
were these thoughts in me that were associated with sublime happiness. And I didn't really know what it was. And then for many, many years in my life, she was not present. And then she came back. And then she came back a few years before I started to work on this book.
This is
And then
great.
suddenly she was back in the book. But then after I was done with the book, I was actually in this state of complete sadness, you know. Then there was something was so empty inside me, and I didn't really know to continue. But the continuation that came, I think that's the topic for the next conversation we should have, is very interesting, because the continuation led me to the book that I'm working now, but
Huh.
also to Thérèse of Lisieux, actually.
Wow.
Well, I want to keep
Super
talking about
fascinating.
her.
Everything you said. Yeah.
I'll keep talking. The eternal feminine leads us ever onward, right? And I think that's certainly what you're describing. And when we talked on the phone once last week, that's what I told Mike. I said, you know, this book, you got to check it out. It's pure sophiology.
Yeah.
And Martin, I don't think knew anything or too much about sophiology before.
No, I looked up only after our last conversation.
Okay.
And now I looked it up and I read something about it.
Yeah.
But also, I should say,
very-
when I was thinking of this character, it is sort of very clear, if you really reflect on what is happening in the book, that nobody really can be like that. On one hand, you know. On the other hand, she is everybody. Everybody
Yeah.
could be like this. So the reason beyond the title beyond of the book is beyond confusion. So
Yeah.
what I want to say is, this is how the world looks like if you are an individual beyond the confusion of selfishness. And she is beyond the confusion of selfishness. And this is how the world looks to her.
Yeah. And what's beautiful about it is
Beautiful.
she's in the text. I mean, she's not just like this pure goddess figure, but because, you know, you see in the conversations where she expresses doubts or uncertainty sometimes, and the dialogue with her and the male character is just it's so human, because it shows this you know, I mean, you can think about Robert Frost when he talked about why he wrote poetry as a kind of love argument with the world, right? There's love and there's uncertainty on both parts of the two main characters at times, you know, but when it's the least uncertain moments are when they come the closest together, right? And it's very tender the way you do it, and it's not easy to pull that off. But on the other hand, you also bring in to the book some of the other faith traditions, which I think, and you do it very, very beautifully and very well, including Taoism makes an appearance.
The Bhagavad Gita is huge.
Mm-hmm.
The Bhagavad Gita, I love, as Mike, we talked about this before, I have a special place in my heart for the Hare Krishnas
Yeah.
that were around where I lived when I was a kid. Some of the best Christians I've ever met. So why don't you could talk about that a little bit, Martin, about those forays into those traditions.
I should say so this happened really when I first traveled to Japan, and I was fascinated to encounter Buddhism there, and I realized I have to study Buddhism, I have to learn about Buddhism, which I did. Then for many years I read Buddhist texts, and they fascinated me. And I realized that Buddhism comes out of Hinduism, so I want to read some Hindu texts, and that led me to the Bhagavad Gita. And the Bhagavad Gita became actually my most read book over a period of a few years. Actually, every evening I would go to the Bhagavad Gita, and in particular, I liked this translation of Eknath Easwaran, but also I have other translations, many others actually. And so for me, the Bhagavad Gita is, I mean, Gandhi calls it a gospel of selflessness.
Uh-huh.
And I find the message so resonating with Christianity and so resonating also with Greek philosophy. So we are asked to see the same God in every person. God is innermost existence in everything that exists is sort of the foundation of Christian teaching. In the Bhagavad Gita, we hear that we have to see the same God in every person. We have to think of the sufferings of others as our own. At the same time, it's a call for action. It's a call for selfless action without being attached to the outcomes of the action. So in the movement too, actually, we are in this other realm, and in this other realm, there's also a woman and a teacher. And I imagine this sort of the first realm is more like in the modern times, and the other one is more like in the medieval or whoever, wherever. And there is this other couple suddenly appearing, and we begin to understand this must be the same woman. For some reason, that's the same woman, but two different men. And these discussions then start about Hinduism, but then also about Buddhism. And she is sort of very kind to this person, and she calls him teacher. But in that second movement, there's already no longer a delusion there. So there are also these dissonances in the book deliberately. Like in the first movement, you think this is a man who knows a lot, and she just asks questions, but it isn't like that. It's not at all like that. And in the second movement, then she calls this other person the teacher, but she does all the teaching. Everything we learn from her. And so they talk about Hinduism, and she gives this account of the Bhagavad Gita. And then later he asks her about Buddhism, and she knows so much about Buddhism, and he doesn't understand where the knowledge comes from. Because in this village where she is, there's no book about Buddhism, and she explains it as if this is first-hand knowledge. And so this mystery of her sort of continues to develop in movement too. And this is how these other questions come in, and then we go to Japanese Buddhism.
Hey, would you like to read a little bit of that?
Yeah, I think we can read the opening of movement 2. So this is I have prepared movement 2 opening. So the interesting thing is the first movement really it ends with his question in this modern realm, who are you? So he is so stunned by her that all he can say then is, who are you? You know, I no longer ask you sort of anything. I just want to know, who are you? So the first movement ends with the question, who are you? The second movement starts with her question, who am I? So she's now in this other realm, and she says to this other person, good teacher, where have I come from? And why your efforts at teaching me? And then he answers, you came here long ago. You were completely alone. You stood in front of the gate. You did not strike the bell. You did not draw attention. You just waited patiently until someone noticed you. When a woman passed by, you showed her the letter. It was a folded piece of paper with a few words written on it. The woman could not read them, but she asked you to come inside. Various people looked at the letter, and eventually it was deciphered. With this child, I'm sending you an image of the goddess of wisdom. No such image was found on you, and everyone was surprised, but they decided to let you stay and find a home in the village. You were admitted to school, and then as the years passed, the teachers began to realize the true meaning of the letter. You yourself were the image. You excelled in every subject. Brightly you shone in wisdom and in all matters of the heart.
Beautiful.
And Mike?
So this quote, it's already the beginning reference to Buddhism, because this is Honen. This is the monk Honen who is sent to Enrakuji with precisely that message. That's what I'm citing here. With this child, I'm sending you an image of the goddess of wisdom.
Wow.
The goddess of wisdom. And we know her name, right, Mike?
We call her Sophia, but in this one, again, there's a strong truth there. Wisdom and truth are really, that's maybe the science, right brain and left brain thing going on. You have truth. As, Martin has actually poeticized the left brain a little bit with, what he's doing with truth there, that Simone Weil, we talked about her, she thought like sometimes when justice comes in conflict with truth, there's a huge problem there. One can go over. But anyhow, I see that dalliance. And I wonder, Martin, if you saw my forays into the book. I thought of, Pyotr Kropotkin, the role of evolution. I mean, in evolution of cooperation. And again, I wanted to say right away that word itself is so poetically evocative for me. But with your background, how scandalous is that nowadays, right? It's just because as a poet too, you can do more with your type of work, courageous work. You can do so much. Because we've created a world in the image of survival of the fittest purely. We've by design systematically ruined our own ability to see cooperation out there. So, what we've done is turned the world into this kind of like beehive left brain nightmare. I really want to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you for what you're doing with that. A little bit about that, or bring it right back to the book. This is about the book.
It's also in the book, but it has also been the topic of my scientific work, independent of the book, for the last 20 years, really, my work on cooperation. I have suggested that evolution, in the classical Darwinian sense, recognizes only two fundamental principles. This is mutation and selection. And I have proposed that cooperation is a third fundamental principle of evolution. And cooperation means that individuals, this can be cells, this can be genes, this can be molecules, in the competition for survival, they help one another. Yeah. And cooperation I have described as the master architect of evolutionary biological complexity. Yeah. So for me, evolution is different. Now evolution is actually three fundamental principles: mutation, selection, and cooperation. And it was cooperation from the beginning. So no origin of life without cooperation, no first without cooperation, no multicellular organism, no animal society, no human language without cooperation. Cooperation does all of that for us. And now suddenly the world makes sense. The biological world makes sense because it is cooperation. And in the human realm, especially, we are asked to cooperate. And forgetting cooperation, being selfish, that's the mistake. That is what is the all-destructive force. Yeah.
Really fascinating that your professional career, was followed. Like integrity is just like halo upon halo surrounding you, that you were seeing this. It was obviously a push and pull factor, but you were seeing this cooperation. But like what you've done on your quest, which is reflected in the book, is really, it's a work of integrity, your holiness, because you're whole. You've been pursuing wholeness, that your thoughts align with your actions. And this whole thing is it's a lot to think about. It's very, very impressive.
Yes, I think really evolution properly understood gives us a very different worldview. And it actually gives us a worldview that leads us right to God.
And you're, of course, familiar with Kropotkin's name, but, I tell students that I would teach humanities, very, introductory level at an undergrad. But I just wanted to say, like, essentially the same time, somebody's walking around, he was a prince, but he had a real eye for nature. And all of a sudden he saw cooperation everywhere as Darwin was in the Galapagos, right? And we need that poetic balance to say, there was another genius. We just weren't reading his stuff at that point. And he saw cooperation everywhere and he wrote it down. And politically, for another conversation, you said about the book you're working on, for Kropotkin, he becomes Darwin. Darwin is Darwin shows up in politics, folks. Survival of the fittest in economics. He shows up. Kropotkin shows up in a peace and love anarchist movement that maybe its greatest proponent in the world right now is Guido Preparata, whose father was a theoretical physicist at Princeton. I think the institute, got in a big fight with Richard Feynman over, models of theory. But, so that I wonder, at another time, the role of your work in a more irenic society, a more irenic world. You see that, I'm sure. What other places do you try to make that connection obvious?
Yes, so in my first paper as a PhD student, with my PhD advisor Carl Sigmund in Vienna, we cite Kropotkin. Actually,
wow.
This was one of the things that led us to cooperation, to led us to start cooperation.
Yeah, and you think in your own life that influenced the person you are today? It has to.
So it was very slow in the making. So it always seems that in my trajectory things were random and suddenly they came together. Mostly, I feel without any doing of mine. So things happen, they just unfold. So I also should mention, very important for me was I always felt I was close to God, but I really had no ability to talk about this. So I was just purely doing scientific work and writing papers. But at Harvard, I was introduced to Sarah Coakley, and then I had many, many meetings with her. And she became my mentor in this exploration of theology and philosophy. And I really owe it to her to be able to express my thoughts in this area. And so for many years, we had then research programs together, and they were funded by the Templeton Foundation, and we invited speakers, and we had many discussions. And this is how really I fell in love more and more with this question of science and religion. And Sarah also always told me, told us and others that we have to bring philosophy to the table because philosophy is needed in the science-religion debate.
Absolutely. And I think you talk about competition. I mean, you want to see survival of the fittest, visit any department in a college or university. Talk about cutthroat. And cooperation is in most circumstances almost non-existent. I mean, you can find it, but it's the exception, not the rule. And the same thing as Mike mentioned with our political environment or our economic environment. They're all kind of contaminated by that Darwinian survival of the fittest, or as what's his name, Cornel West says, the survival of the slickest.
Yeah.
But I think just going back to the kind of like the founding of this podcast, Mike, right?
Yeah.
Where we wanted to get away from that. I mean, the sophological impulse, you could say, but to rethink localism and rethink what it means to be human, because we know the kind of cutthroat environment we're so immersed in that we can't even almost imagine ourselves out of it. Sometimes you have to say no, right? You have to assert things, and I think Martin does that in not only his scientific work but in this book that shows you that there's another way, and it's only another way. It's the right way.
Yeah, but even there's an impulse, Martin, in this show that is happy to engage with the thought of the Austrian mystic Rudolf Steiner. It's not subservient to that worldview at all, but very Goethean. But again, one of the things I think inspires some of our reflections on this show is that, in one aspect, this thing called social threefolding that kind of came from Steiner, that the economic system could be analogous to, one system in the body, the political system, and then the cultural sphere. But the idea that the key thing is that they all can work together in a beautiful harmony. You read Darwin, you just don't think that can happen. You don't think it can happen. So you have this political system that kind of says, the Republicans are all the economic system, and they're at war with Democrats who are the political system. And it's a nightmare. And again, the symbolism of what you're doing is really, really, really profound. And, I hope it's as meaningful. It's risky. It's risky. People are going to want to kill you. But, I hope you're getting pretty close to the Holy Grail when you're talking about cooperation. That's why I'm so animated about that word. And that's why we began by talking about the revolutionary nature of words like pity, mercy, peace, and love, or peace, love, and understanding. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Martin.
Yes, I think it's really true. So in the book, there comes the imagination of a world that is very different.
Yes.
And I have this very short passage that I have thought about that I could read, is that it's something from movement 2 still. It's in the modern realm. They are walking in this museum. And in the museum, there's this connection between her and all sorts of art objects that they see there. Actually, there's the shield of Achilles there, the first ekphrasis in history of the Iliad. But then also it explains the cover, because there are Botticelli paintings, and they're standing in front of these Botticelli paintings, and they are being described. And this cover is not the famous Venus of the Uffizi, but it is the much lesser known Turin Venus. It is Botticelli.
So go ahead and read that.
Sorry?
Go ahead and read that. Yeah.
So in that museum, they are standing, and he is just looking at the objects and at her, and then suddenly this thoughts in him. He wondered, what if the world was not ruled by power and greed, was not ruled by malice and anger, but was ruled by loving kindness? What if people could find her? No law of nature precluded that state, but how could it be reached? It was a recurrent dream. Imagine the form of the good, not as a servant, but as a ruler, as a clearly visible beacon of light.
Wow, you caught it. I was at a party yesterday. I can't help but sharing, but it was all of us were Catholics there. We happened to be, but a dear friend of mine who might be listening to this, Adam Barrett, he serves in the military, and very compassionate guy. But we were talking about like seemingly the intractable problem, the geopolitical problem of the existence of like Muslims or something, And the conversation wasn't shallow, but all of a sudden it was brought to a point where I think the only thing a sane person can say is like, we need to get along. There's no problem, folks. We need to start talking to each other and get along, And I find myself reaching that point in conversations. And I think I say it without any affectation, and I don't know what that means. But I knew sometimes when you hear that voice, somebody saying, oh, it can sound preachy or something. But like once a conversation leads to where we are in politics now, all these gridlocks, is Trump Hitler or is he not exactly Hitler? That we might start bringing back the humanity. Like, I'm not so sure he's exactly the same person as Adolf Hitler. I know people who've known him. Is he an outrageous Barnum and Bailey, creature of the earth, American Caesar figure, larger than life, weird, bad in many ways? Yes. Narcissist, yes. But I think most of our language now scales up. It goes 0 to 50 so quick, where we're using words like the new Hitler and Antichrist and things like that we now have a window where we can talk about peace, love, and understanding, because we see, or the existence of nuclear weapons, they came a long time ago. We're now in a position where we need to talk about peace, love, and understanding.
Right.
Yeah. And in fact, I remember having some conversations with some college students, and I kept saying, but why is there still war? We haven't figured out that's not healthy yet. But there's still...
Wasn't Oppenheimer the premise like, I angst over it, but we still got to do it. And I think that's where the powers that be want us to be. Like, we got to angst over mass annihilation, but it's still a useful tool. And I'm not so sure we can't move the conversation beyond that.
Well, and that's why I think there's a counter movement in the world that is moving toward cooperation, or at least like Martin said earlier, simplicity.
Yeah, what gives you hope?
Simple. I mean, and who was I talking to the other day? I'm talking to my wife, and I can't remember what it was, but I was telling, it was one of the kids probably. I was, the thing is, it's about guitar parts, because I was trying to learn how to play the intro to The Boxer by Simon Garfunkel.
Okay, yeah.
The song's pretty easy to play, but that intro always gave me trouble. And I saw somebody playing it online the other day. I said, "Oh, that's how you do it." And once I found it, it's so simple. It's very simple, but it's not typical.
Counterintuitive, maybe, yeah.
Well, it's not even counterintuitive. It's just that you always try to make it harder than it is, right? And as Martin said earlier about even looking for scientific explanations, looking for what the simple explanation, because and for some reason the simple is more beautiful, it seems.
Is that what you're finding when maybe you can bring it together as a poet? You talked about mathematics kind of having a language below the world. What are you finding there? Paradox and peacefulness? Are you finding light mixed with darkness?
Harmony, I would say harmony. We
That's
find
great.
harmony, but we find beauty. So this is also discussed. This is discussed in Movement 3 in the book. There's a conundrum here. So first of all, why is everything mathematical? Why is the world mathematical? Why is the best possible science actually mathematics? Why is the language of science mathematics? And then the question is, why is mathematics beautiful? Every mathematician sort of experiences mathematics as very beautiful.
Pascal.
Why is mathematics beautiful? So then, what is beauty? Beauty is goodness. Back to Plato, what is the good? What is the beauty? We are back to God. So the world is mathematical because the world is divine, because God's thoughts are beautiful. God has the maximally ordered thoughts. And the maximally ordered thinking, the most beautiful thinking is the divine thought. And the world is created according to this divine thought.
Yeah.
Well, but by the way, also, so if somehow you find yourself in an environment where people are very skeptical about religion or God or faith, so then the typical worldview that you encounter is that I'm only interested in the material world and I'm only interested in science, and science explains everything.
Yeah.
And so then against this sort of, then I ask the question, if you say science explains everything, what about mathematics? Because science does not explain mathematics. In fact, mathematics can be inspired by scientific questions, but mathematics does not need experimental confirmation. Mathematics establishes truth by itself.
Yeah.
So it's not that science explains mathematics, it's the other way around. Mathematics is needed to explain science.
Yeah.
And
in that
worldview of complete materialism completely false
Yeah.
once you realize this.
Yeah.
Because mathematics is not material.
Right.
It's not material, that's right. And you make the best possible tool that you have, science, dependent on something which is not material, not temporal. It's sitting in the immaterial. It is sitting in the, what's happening here? It's sitting in the immaterial. It is sitting in the
Somebody's listening live.
eternal realm. And
Yeah.
this for me is 2 steps towards the divine.
Yeah.
So
Here's a question.
Depends on the divine.
Yeah, it's in this world that we're talking about, and it's a shout out to a friend of Michael and mine who's been on the podcast twice, Lindsay Rose. And Lindsay Rose, an author we have in common. This gentleman's name is Peter Kingsley, but he writes about the pre-Socratics, so Parmenides and Empedocles and so forth. But what he wants to do, and this has to do with the world you might be investigating in math, and there's some stuff I don't know here. And you would know more than me, even about the question I'm asking. So I'm thanking you ahead of time, and also just punt on this. But the pre-Socratics want to kind of say that the origins of logic, the principle of non-contradiction, it comes from poems of people who buried themselves in mud, like Parmenides, initiates, whose whole world was going to meet the divine goddess. You know, there's our Sophia. And they come out with paradox, darkness and light. And we talk a lot on this world about like the underworld. And I think when we talk about the underworld, the overworld, as like Pseudo-Dionysius describes it, you know, very Platonic, light, 9 spheres, not too complicated. The underworld is light mixed with darkness. It's more globular. You know, we see that in the Native American. How does your book and your work in mathematics, does it dovetail with questions like that, Martin?
So
and also,
in the book, actually, in movement 2, they are standing in front of Raphael's painting of the Athenian Academy.
Okay, right.
There,
yeah.
And she points out to him Heraclitus and Parmenides. And so basically the one says, what is and what is not can never be. And the other one says, everything is in flux. So we have these 2 dichotomies. Everything is in flux, and the other one, what is and what is not can never be. And the amazing thing is, what are you attracted to, and what's the resolution? So Plato actually offers already the resolution. So the resolution is what is unchanging is the world of forms, and what is changing is the material instantiation. So as a mathematician, when somebody says to you, what is and what is not can never be, that makes complete sense, actually. That's what happens every day. You know, that's how the world actually is. You know? And I find it amazing.
That's great.
Well, I was talking to somebody a couple weeks ago on a podcast. He was trying to get me to explain what sociology is. It's an accurate description of reality. It's not, you know, people talk about it. Is it a philosophy? No, it's a description of reality, right? And I think that's why you know, the sciences and mathematics and the arts, they're all part of it, because those all are and the idea of beauty, which is so prevalent in your book, this idea of beauty. You know, I love having conversations with college freshmen. You know, I ask them, why is there beauty? Why is there color? Why, you know, why do you ever think about this? These basic, I always tell them, philosophy is just really asking basic, really stupid questions. But then the more you think about them, you realize they're not stupid at all. Why is there beauty? What is love?
Yes, and
Why
for
do you
me, the
feel love for
interesting
another
thing is
person?
questions such as those, what is beauty or what is love? For me, for many of my scientific colleagues, they would be scientific questions. So they would start to think scientifically. But for me, those questions are philosophical questions.
And
Yeah.
I wonder now. I didn't even tell you about this ahead of time, but I think you brought it up, so it's fair game. Talking about music, right? And you organized your book in movements, like you said, inspired by Mahler. And I remember one time I took my kids. I think Aiden was 23 and I was probably 5, 6 maybe. And at the University of Michigan, which is only half an hour away, there was a performance of The Lark Ascending by Ralph Vaughan Williams, which is one of my favorite pieces of music ever. And it's extraordinary. And the thing is, here it is. Here's this piece of music, no words, yet it can transport us into, you can only describe it as a spiritual realm. And I'll never forget sitting there and it was so crowded. My kids and I had to sit on the steps in the aisle. And the young woman who was playing the solo violin part, she was up there, and you could feel in the auditorium everyone's attention was on her. And not only was everyone's attention on her, it, they wanted her to succeed. They already loved her before she played a note, and you
That's
could
well
just
said.
feel it. And it was pretty extraordinary.
Yeah.
But if you ask some scientific materialists, why is there music? And I heard somebody gave me this explanation one time, and I was like, he said, because in primitive societies, men who could make good music were better at securing mates. I'm like, okay, maybe that's true. It explains Mick Jagger. But
It didn't work for Orpheus, right?
so yeah,
His line ended getting mauled.
it did work but Orpheus was not a scientific materialist.
Right.
And he made rocks move.
Yeah.
Okay,
But
let me see.
the connection to music, so my
Yes.
love for Mahler actually started with one of my first students in Oxford, Sebastian Bonhoeffer, came to my office and says, do you want to come to the Sheldonian Theatre tonight? Because we, the Students' Orchestra, we perform a Mahler symphony.
Wow.
And that was the first Mahler symphony I heard, and he played the cello, one of the lead cellos there. He was a very good cello player still. I mean, he still is a very good cello player. And so this is how I fell in love with Mahler. And then many years later, I read the following story about the first performance of Mahler, Symphony No. 2, The Resurrection, which is one of the greatest, of course. And so first performance was conducted by Mahler himself in Berlin, and he paid out of pocket, for everything, for the whole staging of it, and the problem was they couldn't sell any tickets. They couldn't, nobody was interested, nobody came, so they couldn't sell any tickets. So in the end, they asked random people from the street, just come in, there's a concert, there's a performance of a new symphony, it doesn't cost anything. They just asked random people to come in. Then the performance took place, he conducted it himself, and afterwards the following description was given. The audience was completely taken. It's as grown-up men were in tears. Complete strangers hugged each other. And when I read this, I thought, this is what I want to achieve with my scientific talks. Unless I achieve this response, I consider myself a failure. This is what you want. And therefore art, coming back to this earlier question, therefore every scientist wants to be an artist, because I think it needs art to achieve something like this. You want to move people.
Yeah. And I think this is interesting for me when I look at the scientific writing of, say, maybe not even 100 years ago, but it's certainly you see it in psychoanalysis and during the age of Freud and Jung, where there was still an artistic way of writing. And I see this in Heisenberg too. I mean, I'm no scientist, but Heisenberg can phrase things beautifully and descriptively, and whether he's right or not is only part of the point. The point is they were writing to be understood, whereas more and more in our day, and even in my field, in English literature, people don't write to be understood. people write to get published, and it's not the same thing as to be understood. And which I think, because of that hyper specialization, writing for each other, you don't get the. And I think the lesson, one of the lessons of your book, Martin, is you didn't write this for specialists. You wrote this for, I would say, what they used to call the common reader, but it allows people outside of your discipline, outside of your sub-discipline, to engage with your ideas in a very real and human way, right? And to feel, for the reader, I mean, this is my experience as a reader, to feel welcomed in to your heart, to your mind, right? And I'll never forget, speaking of the Hare Krishnas, when we used to hang out with them back in the day, one of them told me, and it stayed with me, and I mentioned it on the show before. He said, you know, one of the ways of showing love is to reveal your heart to another person, to reveal your mind to another person. And I'll never forget that. And I think that's what I, if nothing else, that's, I mean, and there's many other things, but that's one thing I really get from your book, is that kind of openness and generosity of soul that allows us to enter into your heart, into your mind, right?
That's nice.
Beautiful. So running a lot of time here. So wonder if you could read us another passage from the book before we finish up.
So we have now in movement 3, there's something new happening. There's a kind of call coming for her. And this is where I think it's a key chapter for me, where kind of some aspects of her identity are revealed. So this chapter in movement 3 starts in the following way. She got up early, as was her custom. During morning prayers in the chapel, she was shivering under her hood. Each day is God's gift, she thought. Later, when working in the garden, she was thinking of sowing salt, but she had neither donkey nor ox. She reflected on the futility of time. So we have to ask why this figure here, but let finish the reading. Then one of the milkmaids, we have to discuss milkmaids. Then one of the milkmaids came and revealed, visitors were here who had asked to speak to her. Visitors to see me, she replied. She was both surprised and not, both knowing and unknowing. In all those years in the village, no one had come to see her. She touched the earth once more, inhaled the fragrance of the soil. She wondered, what gives me the right to choose my own path? If I do not choose my path, who chooses for me? If I choose my path, who does the choosing?
That was one of my favorite passages. So glad you read it.
Really?
I put some in my own phone, and that was one of them, of things that jumped out at me. Yeah. Great.
So the very opening is a citation to Odysseus, of course, because Odysseus knew what was happening. He was called to participate in the Trojan War, so he pretended to be insane. He was on the seashore and he was sowing salt there, and he had a donkey and he had an ox. That's the symbolism that is used by Homer, and sort of avoiding that which is to come. And that is quoted here. And so she's kind of thinking there's something happening which I may not want. Maybe I should avoid it.
Yeah.
And milkmaid is actually a quote, because milkmaids are mentioned several times. So that's a quote to Radha. And Radha is sort of the beloved of Krishna.
Yeah.
And so that is, again, the illusion, because the association between Radha and Krishna is extremely important in the book.
Yes, very much. And that's, I think, that's, and I think another thing I really loved about the book is the eros, the pure eros that inhabits the space between the two main figures, which is really consummated in the final pages of the book, where it's a marriage. I always tell my kids, the Bible starts with a wedding and ends with one. Okay, and everything in between is explaining it.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Just one more quote for him. I think to me, your most powerful song to selflessness was these lines. How strange, he thought, to find yourself in a place that contains all books, and then deem it irrational to read a single one. To him, libraries had always been both amazing and intimidating. Then suddenly, to considerable surprise, he perceived a person in one of the adjacent rooms. He was not alone after all. Had a movie started. That was actually a different quote, not the one about selfishness. Sorry, I started reading. Just beautiful, beautiful. You capture so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, in Movement 2, there's this library, and it's quoted from Borges, so it's the library.
Okay, yeah. You're playing with a lot of his book stuff. Yeah.
Yep.
This is related to the genome space that is also being discussed.
Yeah, beautiful.
All right.
Yeah, it's like Michael says, thank you so much, Dr. Martin Nowak. And we encourage people, we're going to link to your book at Angelico Press. Would you like us to share about you with any other links?
Yes, that would be great.
Okay, so would you send me other links to promote your work? Okay, great.
Yes. Thank you
and
so
I'll
much.
put those on. Yeah, I'll put them on the YouTube and on the podcast and everything. So, great, thanks. And Michael, your work, anything new in your?
What is new?
No book
I don't
coming
know.
out?
I don't think so.
Okay.
No. I got a bunch of things coming up, but nothing too soon.
All right. Well, thanks everybody thanks again to Dr. Martin Nowak, and thanks everybody for listening to the Regeneration Podcast. We'll see you again very soon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. So nice to have you.
Thank you so much.